Snow White. It was the middle of winter, and snowflakes fell like feathers from the sky. A queen sat at her window, working on an embroidery frame made of ebony. As she worked, she gazed out at the snow. She pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell on the snow. When she saw how bright and red the blood looked, she said to herself, "Oh, that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of my embroidery frame." Not long after, she had a daughter. The girl had skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. She was named Snow White. After a year, the queen died. The king took another wife, a beautiful but proud woman. She could not bear being surpassed in beauty by anyone. She had a magic mirror that would tell her who was fairest of all. She would stand before it and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of them all?" The mirror would answer, "You are, my lady." The queen grew jealous of Snow White and wanted to kill her. But Snow White was protected by fairies who loved her and helped her escape. Snow White lived happily ever after in the woods, far away from the queen. You are the fairest of all, and she was happy, for she knew that the looking-glass spoke truth. Now Snow White grew prettier and prettier, and when she turned 7 years old, she was as beautiful as a day, far more so than the queen herself. One day, when the queen went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of them all?" it answered, "Queen, you are fair, it is true, but Snow White is fairer." This gave the queen great shock, and she became yellow and green with envy. From that hour, her heart turned against Snow White, and she hated her with envy and pride, like ill weeds growing in her heart higher every day. At last she sent for the huntsman, saying, "Take the child out into the woods, so that I may never see her again. You must kill her and bring me her heart as a token." The huntsman consented and led her away. But when he drew his sword to pierce Snow White's heart, she began to weep and say, "Oh, dear huntsman, do not take my life. I will go away into the wild woods and never come back." And as she was so lovely, the huntsman felt pity for her and said, "Away with you then, poor child," for he thought that the wild animals would surely devour her. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his heart, for he had spared her life. Just then a young wild boar ran by, so he caught it and killed it. Taking out its heart, he brought it to the queen as a token. She salted and cooked it, and the wicked woman ate it, thinking that Snow White was dead. Now, when the poor girl found herself alone in the woods, she felt terror even from the leaves on the trees. She did not know what to do, so she ran over sharp stones and thorn bush. The wild beasts chased after her, but they did not harm her. She ran as long as her legs could carry her, and when the evening drew near, she came to a small house and went inside to rest. Everything there was small, but as pretty and clean as possible. There stood a small table, ready laid with a white cloth, and 7 little plates, 7 knives, forks, and drinking cups. By the wall stood 7 small beds, side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Snow White, being very hungry and thirsty, ate a little porridge and bread from each plate, and drank a drop of wine from each cup, so as not to finish up one portion alone. After that she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds but it did not seem to suit her. One was too long, another too short, but at last the seventh was quite right, and so she laid down upon it, committing herself to heaven, and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters arrived. The house came to life. They were 7 dwarfs, whose job was to dig beneath the mountains. When they lit their 7 candles, it was bright inside the little house. But something was wrong. Everything was out of place. The first dwarf said, "Who's been in my chair?" The second said, "Someone ate from my plate." The third said, "They took my loaf." The fourth said, "Tasted my porridge." The fifth said, "Used my fork." The sixth said, "Cut with my knife." The seventh said, "Drank from my cup." Then the first dwarf looked around and saw a hollow in his bed. He cried out, "Who has been in my bed?" The others ran over to check their beds. They saw little white snow lying there. Asleep, he told the others, who came running up, crying out in astonishment and holding up their 7 little candles to throw light on Snow White. "Oh goodness, oh gracious," they cried, "what a beautiful child is this!" And they were so filled with joy to see her that they did not wake her, but let her sleep on. The 7th dwarf slept with his comrades for an hour at a time, until the night had passed, when it was morning and Snow White woke up. She was very frightened, but the dwarfs seemed quite friendly. They asked her what her name was, and she told them. Then they asked how she had come to be in their house. She related to them how her stepmother had wanted her put to death, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had been running all day long until she had finally found their little house. One of the dwarfs said, "If you will keep our house for us, cook and wash, make the beds, sew and knit, and keep everything tidy, we will be grateful. Clean, you may stay with us, and you will lack nothing foreign." "With all my heart," said Snow White, and so she stayed and kept the house in good order. In the morning the dwarfs would go to the mountain to dig for gold. In the evening they would come home, and their supper would have to be ready for them. All day long the maiden would be left alone, and the good little dwarfs would warn her, saying, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know you were here. Let no one into the house." Now the queen, having eaten Snow White's heart, as she supposed, felt quite sure that she was the first and fairest. So she came to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the glass answered, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White, living in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times fairer than she was." She was very angry, for the glass always spoke truth, and she knew that the huntsman must have deceived her, and that Snow White must still be alive. She thought and thought how she could make an end to her, for as long as she was not the fairest in the land, envy left her no rest. At last she thought of a plan. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one would know her in this disguise. She went across the 7 mountains until she came to the house of the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door and cried, "Fine, where's the best to sell fine wares to sell?" Snow White peeped out of the window and cried, "Good day, good woman. What have you to sell?" Fine wares, she answered. Laces of all colors." She held up a piece that was woven in variegated silk. I need not be afraid to let in this." A good woman thought Snow White was beautiful, and she opened the door and brought the pretty lace. "What a figure you have, child," said the old woman. "Come and let me lace you properly." Snow White stood up before her and let the old woman lace her with new lace. But the old woman did it so quickly and tightly that it took Snow White's breath away, and she fell down like dead. "Now you have done being the fairest," said the old woman as she hurried away. Not long after that, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home and were terrified to see their dear Snow White lying on the ground, without life or motion. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly she had been laced, they cut the lace in 2. Then she began to breathe, and little by little she returned to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said that the old peddler woman must have been the wicked queen. They warned Snow White to be careful and not to let anyone in when they were not there. And when the wicked witch returned home, she went to the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror answered as it had before, "You are of beauty rare, but Snow White, who lives in the glen with the 7 dwarfs, is 1,000 times fairer." When she heard this, the witch was so surprised that all the blood drained from her heart, for she realized that Snow White was still alive. She vowed to think of a way to ruin her, and by witchcraft she created a poisoned comb. She then disguised herself as an old woman and went across the mountains to the house of the dwarfs. She knocked on the door and called out, "Good wares to sell, good wares to buy." Snow White looked out the window and said, "Go away, I must not let anyone in, but you are welcome to look." The witch took out the poisoned comb and held it up, and Snow White touched it. The witch laughed and said, "Now you shall die, Snow White." But Snow White's friends, the dwarfs, came to her aid and saved her from the witch's evil plans. It pleased the poor girl so much that she was tempted to open the door. When the deal was made, the old woman said, "Now, for once, your hair will be properly combed." Poor Snow White thought no harm would come of it, so she let the old woman do as she wished. But no sooner had the comb been put in her hair than the poison began to take effect, and the poor girl fell senseless. "Now you, paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "this is the end of you." She left, but luckily it was near evening, and the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground, they thought immediately that it was the stepmother's doing. They found the poisoned comb, and no sooner had they removed it from her hair than Snow White came back to herself. They warned her once again to be on her guard and never let anyone in again. The queen went home and stood before the mirror, saying, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The fairest of us all, and the looking-glass answered as before, "Queen, you are of rare beauty, but Snow White, living in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times fairer when she hears the looking-glass speak." Thus she trembles and shakes with anger. Snow White shall die. Cry, though it should cost me my own life. And then she goes to a secret, lonely chamber where no one is likely to come. And there she makes a poisonous apple. It is beautiful to look upon, being white with red cheeks, so that anyone who sees it must long for it. But whoever eats even a little bit of it must die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and clothed herself like a peasant woman, and went across the 7 mountains to where the 7 dwarfs lived. When she knocked at the door, Snow White put her head out the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs told me." "Not all right," answered the woman. "I can easily get rid of my apples. Elsewhere I will give you a song." "No, Snow White, I dare not take anything. Are you afraid of poison?" said the woman. "Look here, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You shall have the red side. I will have the white one." For the apple was so cleverly made that all the poison was in the rosy half of it. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple. As she saw the peasant woman eating a piece of it, she could no longer refrain, but stretched out her hand and took the poisoned half. But no sooner had she taken a morsel of it into her mouth than she fell to the earth as dead. The queen, casting on her a terrible glance, laughed aloud and cried, "As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony. This time the dwarves will not be able to bring you back to life again." And when she went home and asked the looking-glass against the wall, "Who is the fairest of all?" at last it answered, "You are the fairest now of all." Then her envious heart found peace, as much as an envious heart could have. The dwarves, when they returned home in the evening, found Snow White lying on the ground. There was no breath coming out of her mouth, and she was dead. They lifted her up, but nothing poisonous could be found. They cut her laces, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but all to no avail. The poor child was dead, and remained so. They laid her on a bed, and sat all 7 of them around, weeping and lamenting for 3 whole days. Then they would have buried her, but she still looked as if she were living, with her beautiful blooming cheeks. So they said, "We cannot hide her away in the dark ground." They made a coffin of clear glass, so that it could be seen from all sides. They laid her in it, and wrote in golden letters upon it her name, and that she was the king's daughter. Then they set the coffin out on the mountain, and one of them always remained by it to watch, and the birds came too, and mourned for Snow White. First an owl, then a raven, and lastly a dove. Now for a long while Snow White lay in the coffin, and never changed, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that one day a king's son rode through the woods and up to the dwarf's house, which was near it. He saw her on the mountain, the coffin, and beautiful Snow White within it, and he read what was written in gold letters upon it. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, and I will give you whatever you ask for it." But the dwarfs told him that they could not part with it for all the gold in the world. But he said, "I beseech you to give it to me, for I cannot live without looking at Snow White. If you consent, I will bring you great honor and care, as if you were my brethren." When he spoke thus, the good little dwarfs agreed. The king's son had pity on the poor man, and gave him a coffin. He called his servants and told them to carry it on their shoulders. As they were walking, they stumbled over a bush, and the poisoned apple flew out of the man's throat. It was not long before he opened his eyes and sat up, alive and well. "Where am I?" he cried. The king's son, full of joy, answered, "You are near me." He told him all that had happened, and said he would rather have him than anything in the world. "Come with me to my father's castle, and you shall be my bride," he said. Snow White agreed and went with him. Their wedding was held with pomp and great splendor. But Snow White's stepmother, jealous of her beauty, also attended the feast. When she looked in the mirror, she asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "You, my dear, are the fairest." The looking-glass replied, "O Queen, although you are very beautiful, the young bride is 1,000 times fairer than you." She railed and cursed, and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. At first she thought she would not go to the wedding, but then she felt that she should not have peace until she saw the bride. When she saw the bride, she recognized her as Snow White, and could not move from the spot. Anger and terror overcame her, for iron slippers had already been placed on the fire, and they were brought to her with tongues and set before her. The queen was forced to put the slippers on and dance until she fell down dead.